Hello friends, it's the Stitches. Today I have a sewing vlog for you that I'm very excited for. I'll be showing you how I made this quilt jacket. It's basically a wearable blanket, but cute. I'm already deeply in love with this garment, and I'm absolutely ecstatic to show it to you, so let's just jump right into it. The first step was obviously to plan out how many quilt squares I would need, based off of the size of the squares and the desired final measurements. This was a process that required measuring myself and lots of math. Math is the bane of my existence, so I had to do this several times, but this is a simple enough project that a certain level of winging it is totally okay. Can you believe that I used to be an honor student? I skipped filming the process of cutting out the squares because it's monotonous and boring, but here are the squares themselves. These are all derived from fabric scraps I already had. Once again, I made it a point to buy nothing for this project and stuck to materials that were already in my fabric stash. Since I wanted this jacket to be as over the top as possible, it was my mission to decorate about half the squares for my jacket, or maybe more accurately a third of them, with embellishments and fabric manipulation. So I brought out all my laces and ribbons, random single buttons, and anything else I thought might be interesting to add. I only filmed the process of decorating a couple squares, because if I filmed the process of every single one of them, not only would this video be unreasonably long, but I would have absolutely lost my mind trying to capture every little step on camera. For this first square though, I used some adorable lace that has little ducks printed on it, gathered it, and covered the edges with another strip of lace. I also used a third kind of lace to create a little floret for the center that would surround a little blue button. With everything pinned in place, I secured the first couple layers of lace with the machine, then I hand-stitched the floret and the button. That finishes up this square. While a lot of my squares are decorated with lace in various arrangements, I also used gathering and pleating to decorate squares. Most of my squares were cut to a size of 6 inches by 6 inches, which would yield a final size of 5 inches by 5 inches after the squares are stitched together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. However, I cut a few squares that were bigger than 6 by 6 so that I could pleat them down. For this square that I'm showing you right now, I ironed folds into the fabric and stitched about a 1/4 inch from the edge, creating this little tuck. It's a bit too big to properly be considered a pin tuck, but that's basically what it is. I stitched lots of little tucks into the fabric until it was the final measurement I desired. Once it was 6 inches wide one way, I started to add tucks that were perpendicular to the original set of tucks. This creates a really interesting layered effect. To finish the square, I trimmed off the excess fabric and backed it with some scrap muslin. Lots of my squares wound up getting backed with muslin because some of my fabrics were a little sheer. The process of decorating all my squares took an embarrassingly long amount of time, but before I start stitching them together, I want to give each one its moment in the sun. So here is every square that I decorated. You can see that some of them are embroidered, some of them are gathered or have pin tucks, and some of them have lace and ribbon and buttons. The only patterned fabric that I didn't cover with decoration were these floral squares, because I just love the print too much to hide it. So let's revisit the square layout. I've categorized my squares into mostly white and mostly pastel colors. First, I laid out squares that alternate between plain pink and plain white, and then pulled out some of the plain squares so that I could replace it with a decorated square. These are the quilt squares that will make up the two front panels of the jacket, so I planned their arrangements side by side so I could be sure they would look good together. Once I was satisfied with the front panel squares, I stacked them up by column and labeled them before moving on to the back panel. For this panel I used the same concept, just lay out squares and then replace some and move it around until it looks sufficiently over the top. While I'm on the subject, my white squares are a cut-up bedsheet that I thrifted, and the pink squares are pink chiffon fabric that has been layered over fabric from another thrifted bedsheet. The pink chiffon came from the chiffon I used for my previous, and now current, background setup that wound up being unused excess. So here's my squares now that they've all been stacked and labeled so I can remember what goes where. I started with my columns, stitching them together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance like I mentioned earlier. Then I pressed open my seam allowance. I didn't serge anything because the idea of serging each individual square, I don't remember exactly how many of them I used, but there are over 100, just seemed like a task I was simply unwilling to do. Here I have both columns of one of my front panels. For the next step, I'm going to stitch them together. And then press open the seam allowance once again. I repeated those steps over and over again until all of my panels were assembled. I don't currently possess any quilt batting, but I do have some fleece that's been in my sewing stash since high school. I'm always looking for an excuse to use up fabric that I've had longer than 10 years, and it'll accomplish the same effect. I laid my panels out over the fleece as if they were pattern pieces, and cut out a new panel from the fleece. This will create the fluffy inner layer that will not only make the jacket nice and warm, but it will also add some bulk which contributes to the oversized, wearable blanket look. Next, I cut some lining out of the rest of my white bedsheet. In the end, I'm left with 3 different versions of each panel, one from quilt squares, one of fleece, and one of lining. After giving my fleece a good lint roll, I pinned my quilted panel to it so that I could flatline them together. This goes over to the sewing machine, where I stitched the 2 pieces together just inside the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once all my quilted panels have been backed with fleece, it's time to start actually assembling the jacket.
And now it's time for a quick commercial break.
First, I trimmed away the excess fleece to remove some of the bulk from the seams. Then I pinned my front panels to the back panel, leaving a large enough opening at the sides to insert the sleeve. Before moving on, I also pinned my sleeves as well, turning the panels into long tubes. Now I can move back over to the sewing machine and stitch the jacket seams. Once everything is stitched, predictably, it's time to press the seams open. Then the sleeves are inserted into the sleeve opening and stitched into place. Here is the jacket as it exists so far on the dress form. I've kept the actual structure of the jacket as simple as possible, just using a bunch of varied sized rectangles, because it adds to the homemade grandma's quilt but wearable aesthetic that I'm going for. Now it's time to assemble the lining. The panels are assembled in the exact same way as the outer fabric, so we'll just skip to the finish line. Oh look, a lining. But wait! What use is a jacket if it doesn't have any pockets? I took some of my leftover quilt squares and did a cute little magic trick with them, so that now they've been assembled to make a larger square. These have once again been backed with thrifted bedsheet fabric. I stitched the now larger squares down to the front panels of the lining, so they'll sit just on the inside of the jacket. This technique is called a patch pocket, and whenever you add patch pockets to anything, you want to sew a little triangle at the top opening to add some extra reinforcement. Now I'll just slide the lining into the outer jacket fabric, and then I pinned the 2 layers together in preparation for binding. Since traditional quilts are often finished with a fabric binding, I pulled out yet another thrifted bedsheet from my fabric stash, this time in a pink that fits into my color scheme. I cut the sheet into 2-inch strips. At the ironing table, I folded the raw edges in 1/2 inch and pressed them in place. Then I folded the whole thing in half lengthwise and pressed it again. The result is a 1/2 inch wide strip of binding. I used this pink binding to finish the edges of my jacket by securing it with an invisible stitch. It was a long process to do it by hand, but I was really dedicated to the charming handmade aesthetic, so it was worth it to not have any visible machine stitching on the outside of the final jacket. And now the jacket is done. I started this project several months ago, but I kept putting it down for a few weeks, picking it up again, putting it down again, and then finally just got sick of it taking up space on my cutting table and pushed to finish it. It was actually still cold out when I first started decorating squares. Now it's finished at last, and I can't wait for winter to come back. Unlike me, if you happen to live in the southern hemisphere, however, it's actually the perfect time of year to finish a project like this. Even though it's absolutely way too warm to wear a literal quilt on my body, here's a couple outfits anyway. For my first coordinate, I've paired the jacket with a solid pink one-piece from Baby the Stars Shine Bright. My head bow is also from Baby. My lavender sweater knit thigh-highs add to the cozy, cold weather feel. And if you've been around a while, you might recognize this Patchwork bunny bag. I couldn't resist wearing it with this jacket since they go together so well, on account of being made up of a lot of the same scrap fabrics. For my second look, since one of the blue plaid fabrics I used for my jacket is the same fabric I used to make these bloomers, I wanted to see how they would look together. I've layered the jacket over a Baby the Stars Shine Bright blouse and a vintage sweater vest. I basically wore this exact outfit in my sewing blog where I made these bloomers, only now with the addition of the jacket. But hey, it's a good outfit, it deserves to be seen again. That's all for today. I'm so happy to be able to add this jacket to my wardrobe. I don't really do quilting projects ever, so this was highly unfamiliar territory for me. I think it came out great though, even if some of my squares didn't perfectly align, but perfection was not the goal here anyway. I hope everyone has a great day, and with that, I'll see you all next time. Bye!